The land sat in the northeast corner of Harlan County, Nebraska, just below the Republican River bottoms, and it had been described the same way for the better part of 40 years. Thin, hard, brushy. What grass came up in May was yellow by the end of June, and the creek that ran through the middle third of it dried to a string of puddles every August without exception. Grain farmers driving past on County Road 14 called it the sand stretch. The polite ones called it that. The 7,000 acres had changed hands twice since 1987, and neither time at a number anyone would brag about. The last time it sold, in 2009, it went for $680 an acre, low even for rough ground in Harlan County. The man who bought it held it 7 years, ran a few cattle on the creek flats when the grass cooperated, and eventually decided he'd been wrong about it. He took a modest loss and moved on. By the spring of 2019, it belonged to First Consolidated Agricultural Trust out of Omaha. The bank had paid $1 million. They were not farming people. They were investment people, and they had looked at $580 an acre and seen a number low enough to be interesting. A distressed asset in a county where better ground was trading at $1,200, sometimes higher, and where land values had been climbing since 2014. Their model said hold it 3 years, lease the grass, and sell at a patient profit. They had done this before in Custer County and gotten out fine. They hired a land management firm. The firm walked the ground, confirmed what everyone already believed about it, and arranged a grazing lease with a neighbor at $6.50 an acre. The bank was satisfied. The model was on track. There was one thing the model did not account for. Her name was Della Moser. She was 11 years old, and her family's farm shared a fence line with the northeast corner of that sand stretch for nearly 1.25 miles. Somebody had to pay attention to what happened next, and the person who did was a man named Walt Kepler, who had been running a small cow-calf operation in Harlan County since 1978, and who had known Della's grandfather since the two of them were in the 4-H program together in 1964. Walt told the story the way he told everything, slow, with long pauses, and with the specific feeling that he had already decided what the point was before he opened his mouth. He said later that when Della first walked into the bank's regional office in Alma in October of 2019, he happened to be in the parking lot coming out of a meeting about an irrigation easement on his own ground. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Just a girl in a barn coat, maybe 11 or 12, with a yellow legal pad tucked under her arm and a look on her face like she was about to ask for directions, but had already thought through 3 different ways to get there. He said he thought about it considerably more when he found out what was on that legal pad. Stories like this one don't get told much anymore. If you believe they deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of this matters. The Moser place had been in the family since 1941, when Della's great-great-grandfather, Raymond Moser, bought 680 acres of river bottom and upland pasture after coming home from the grain elevator business in Concordia, Kansas. Raymond hadn't gone to any agricultural college. He had gone to the elevator, and the elevator had taught him things about grain that most farmers who grew it never learned. Things about moisture content, about fungal load, about what the ground gave up and what it kept depending on the year. He had an eye for what other people's inattention looked like, and he had the patience to wait until inattention became an opportunity. He kept a ledger. Not just a ledger of money, though he kept those too. A different kind of ledger, rainfall by the week, grass color by the month, what the Republican River did in flood years and what it left behind when it pulled back. He noted soil color when he fenced. He noted what grew in the fence rows without any help from anyone. He noted what his neighbor's ground looked like after a wet spring compared to what the sand stretch to the northeast looked like, and he wrote down the differences with the same careful hand he used for everything else. He wrote in that ledger until 1973, the year he died at the age of 78, sitting in a lawn chair on the east side of the machine shed on a September afternoon, watching a thunderstorm build over Kansas. The ledger passed to his son, Gerald. Gerald was a practical man, competent with cattle and equipment, less interested in observation for its own sake. But he understood what his father had built, and he kept the practice going, less detailed, more abbreviated, but consistent. Gerald added to the ledger for 22 years, until his own health gave out in 1995. By then, there were 4 notebooks. Gerald's son, Tom Moser, Della's father, knew they were there and felt like they ought to stay there, and didn't open them with any regularity. He was a busy man with a working farm to run. That was not a criticism. That was just true. Della found the first ledger when she was 8 years old. She had been looking for a stapler, which she was fairly sure was on the second shelf of the farm office, and she found the 1952 notebook instead because it had a drawing on the cover. A quick pencil sketch of a horse in a pasture, just 3 or 4 lines that Raymond had put there for no reason she could ever figure out. She opened it. She read the first entry, dated April 3rd, which described the condition of the grass on the northeast corner of the neighboring ground, and compared it to what had come up the same week in 1946 and 1949. Raymond had an opinion about why the difference happened. He wrote it down. Della read for 40 minutes. She forgot entirely about the stapler. What she found across all 4 notebooks, she read them all before the end of that year, then read them again, was not what most people would have found interesting. There were no dramatic stories, no crisis entries, no moments of reckoning written in a shaking hand. What there was, page after page across 5 decades, was observation. Raymond and then Gerald had watched the sand stretch the way a doctor watches a patient, not for what was wrong exactly, but for what it was doing, and whether that matched what it had done before. Raymond had noted what the northeast quadrant of that 7,000 acres did in wet years. He had written down the creek behavior in spring. He had recorded what the subsoil looked like when he pushed a fence post into it, darker than you'd think for ground that looks this poor on the surface. He wrote in May of 1958, which suggests something is holding moisture below that first foot. He had recorded the way the grass came back differently in that corner than it did in the rest of the sand stretch. Thicker, slower to yellow, more varieties. He suspected calichet, not the shallow kind that roots can't get through, the kind that sits deep enough to give the soil above it something to hold on to, a subsurface clay layer acting like a slow drain that never quite empties. Raymond had no soil science training. He had the elevator and 40 years of watching ground. By the time Della was 10, she had read the ledgers twice each. She had also gone, by herself on her bicycle in the spring of 2018, to the Harlan County Extension Office in Alma and asked to look at the soil survey maps. The woman at the desk, Linda Partridge, who had worked at that counter for 19 years and had seen most of what walked through the door, said later that she had never had a 10-year-old come in and ask for the county soil survey. She said Della had written down the soil series numbers in a spiral notebook, her own, not Raymond's, and had asked 3 specific questions about subsurface clay content, cation exchange capacity, and what the extension records showed about forage production in that series in above-average rainfall years. Linda had to look up the answers to 2 of the 3. This was the foundation of what Della brought to the bank in October of 2019. Not the ledgers. She had written it out herself, in 12 pages of careful handwriting on the yellow legal pad. The soil series designations from the extension survey, The rainfall data Raymond had collected from 1941 through 1972, cross-referenced against the notes on subsoil color. Her own observations from walking the fence line with her father's old half-inch soil probe, which she had done 4 times between March and September of that year, pulling cores every 50 yards and logging what she found. Average depth to the clay accumulation horizon, 14 inches. Consistent with both Raymond's 1958 notation and the soil series characteristics in the extension literature. Her conclusion was written plainly. The ground was not what it appeared to be from the road or from a quick walk. In wet cycles, which Harlan County had been trending towards since 2015, the subsurface clay held water that the surface layer gave no sign of. The grass the bank's tenant was grazing at $6.50 an acre could, with rotational management and appropriate stocking rates, support a lease rate 3 times higher on the northeast quarter alone. She included the stocking rate math. She included the estimated annual lease income difference. She was 11 years old, and she had done the arithmetic twice to make sure it was right. The man she met with at First Consolidated was named Richard Halbrook. He was the regional portfolio manager for a 5-county area, responsible for leasing and disposition recommendations on the bank's agricultural holdings. He was a careful man in a pressed shirt, and he was not unkind. He shook Della's hand when she came in, offered her a chair, and listened to what she said. He looked at the yellow legal pad when she put it on the desk. He asked a few questions about the soil probe, about where she had gotten the extension survey, and his questions were reasonable questions, the kind a person asks when they are trying to determine whether something is worth their attention. He told her he appreciated her bringing this in. He told her the bank had a professional land management advisory relationship and that he would pass along her findings for their consideration. He did not pass along her findings. What he did was call the land management firm, Apex Agricultural Advisory out of Lincoln, and ask them to send someone out in the spring of 2020 to reconfirm their original assessment of the property. The Apex representative arrived in April. He was an experienced man with 15 years in agricultural land management, and he walked the ground on a dry day in early spring, which was exactly the wrong time of year to see what Della had been trying to tell them. He looked at the surface. He walked the creek flat. He looked at the cover grass and the condition of the existing pasture, and he wrote what he saw, which was the same thing everyone always saw when they looked at the sand stretch. Thin ground, limited carrying capacity, current lease rate in line with the market for that quality of pasture. He did not look at soil surveys. He did not pull core samples. He did not ask what the ground looked like in a wet year. His assessment came back to the bank, confirming the original position. Halbrook filed it. Walt Kepler walked that fence line with Della in May of 2020. She showed him the probe samples she had saved, labeled with masking tape and a black marker, lined up in yogurt containers on the shelf in the farm office. 9 months of cores arranged by date and location. She showed him the ledger entries. She showed him the soil survey page with the series number highlighted in yellow and the corresponding forage production data circled in pencil. She walked him to the fence, pushed a probe into the ground on the Moser side, then reached through the wire and pushed it into the bank's ground and pulled both cores for him to look at side by side. Walt had been working cattle in Harlan County for 42 years. He had fenced his share of ground. He had pulled his share of cores. He knew what a clay accumulation horizon looked like, and he knew what it meant for grass. He stood at the wire for a while without saying anything, looking at the 2 cores. He looked across the northeast quarter. It was a wet spring, and the grass over there was doing what Della and Raymond both said it did in wet years. Coming up thick, coming up dark, coming up with more species in it than the dry years allowed. "This is right," he said. He didn't elaborate, because it didn't need it. What happened next started the way things in Harlan County tended to start, quietly through people who knew people, with no announcement. Walt called a man named Dale Reuter, who ran a 900-cow commercial cow-calf operation out of Franklin County and who had been looking for lease ground for 2 years. Dale was not easy to impress. He had leased bad ground before, and he had the patience of a man who had learned to look carefully before he committed. Walt told him about the Northeast Quarter, about the subsoil, about the clay horizon, about Della's probe data and the extension survey findings. He told it straight, without embellishment, the way Walt Kepler told everything. Dale drove down on a Thursday in June. He walked the Northeast Quarter with Walt and Della for 2.5 hours. He pulled his own cores at 8 locations. He found the clay layer between 11 and 16 inches, average depth a little over 13. He stood at the north fence and looked back across the quarter and was quiet for a while. "What's this leasing at?" he said finally. Walt told him, $6.50 an acre, going up to $7 on the new term. Dale was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that means he's thinking it over, the kind that means he's already decided. "I'd lease that ground at $20 an acre," he said. "Maybe 22 if the wet cycle holds." Tom Moser called First Consolidated the following Friday. Not Della. Tom? He was a quiet man who did not naturally reach for confrontation and who had spent a 1.5 years watching his daughter work on this problem with a patience and precision that had, at some point, moved him from gentle skepticism to something closer to conviction. He was careful on the phone. He told Halbrook about Dale Reuter's interest and the number Dale had named. He told him about the extension survey findings and the subsurface clay profile and the wet year grass data going back to the 1940s. He said he thought the bank might be leaving a significant amount of money on the table and that he wanted them to have that information before they renewed the lease. Halbrook thanked him. He said he would look into it. 3 weeks passed. Tom called again. Halbrook said the advisory firm was reviewing the assessment. 3 more weeks. 6. The holiday season came and went. In January of 2021, Della wrote Halbrook a letter, handwritten, 2.5 pages on lined paper, with the Soil Series numbers listed in the margin and a reference to a specific University of Nebraska Extension Bulletin. Publication number EC94-121S, which documented the water holding characteristics of Coley-Holdray, complex soils in the Republican River drainage under varying annual precipitation. She folded it into an envelope with her return address and a stamp and put it in the mailbox at the end of the Moser driveway. She received no reply. What came instead in February of 2021 was a notice that First Consolidated had renewed the existing grazing lease with the current tenant. New rate, $7 an acre, up 50 cents. The bank was satisfied. The model was still on track. Walt heard about the lease renewal from Tom. He sat with it for 2 days. He had a decision to make, which was whether this was the Moser family's business and he had already done what he could by walking the fence line, or whether there was one more call worth making. He decided there was. He called a woman named Catherine Flood, who was a soil scientist in the University of Nebraska Extension program at Hastings, whom he had met at a grazing management conference in North Platte in 2011. He had liked her because she talked about soil the way he talked about cattle, like it was something that had a personality and a history and a set of tendencies that rewarded paying attention. He explained what Della had found. He described the probe work, the ledger data, the extension survey, the wet year grass performance, the clay horizon at 14 inches average. He told her that a professional land management firm had walked the ground in spring of 2020 and found nothing. He told her what Dale Reuter had offered. Catherine Flood drove down to Harlan County on a Saturday in November of 2021, which was the kind of thing she apparently did when something interested her enough. She spent 4.5 hours on the northeast quarter with a hand auger, a soil kit, a camera, and a clipboard. She pulled samples at 11 locations. She photographed the profile at each one. She noted the vegetation composition, the infiltration rate at 3 test spots, the color and texture of the material at the clay interface. Her written assessment came back in December. She had concluded that the northeast quarter of the property carried a subsurface clay accumulation horizon consistent with a Coley-Holdredge soil complex, the same designation Della had pulled from the extension survey 2 years earlier, at an average depth of 13.8 inches. Water holding capacity and above average precipitation years was sufficient to support improved grass establishment. Alfalfa production with appropriate variety selection and irrigation planning was possible in the best portions. She estimated lease potential for improved pasture at $18 to $22 an acre. She noted the current lease rate was $7. No an acre. She did not say this was unusual, because she was a careful scientist and not in the business of editorializing. She didn't need to. Somebody sent a copy of that assessment to First Consolidated in January of 2022. Nobody ever confirmed who. Tom said it wasn't him. Walt said it wasn't him. Della, when asked, gave the careful answer she had apparently been thinking about. She said she didn't know how to answer that without getting someone in trouble. And she left it at that. What happened at the bank after they received Catherine Flood's report took about 6 weeks. Halbrook brought it to the Land Committee. The Land Committee contacted Apex. Apex reviewed their own assessment documentation from April 2020. There was a period of what everyone involved probably preferred to call internal review. At the end of it, First Consolidated made 3 decisions. First, they terminated the existing grazing lease, effective the following spring. Second, they retained a different land management firm, not Apex, and commissioned a full soil assessment and lease market analysis for the entire 7,000 acres. Third, they listed the northeast quarter for competitive lease bids. Dale Reuter submitted a bid of $20, $50 an acre. He was the high bid. He got it. The new firm completed their assessment of the remaining acreage in the spring of 2022. Their recommendation included rotational grazing infrastructure, temporary electric fencing, 2 additional water development sites, and a stocking rate adjustment. The revised lease on the remaining ground came in at $9, $25 an acre, up from $7. On 7,000 acres with the northeast quarter separated at the higher rate. The difference between the old total lease income and the new total lease income, annualized, was approximately $76,000 a year. The bank did not call Tom Moser to let him know what had been decided. They did not call Walt. They did not send Della a letter. What they did, in September of 2022, was list the entire property for sale at $150 an acre. At 7,000 acres, that was $35 million. They had bought it for $1 million. The improved lease income had made it a different asset, or more accurately, had made it what it had always been, which was not quite the same thing. Della is 15 now. She runs a small Hereford heifer operation on the Moser place alongside her father, 12 head that she selected, and has managed herself since she was 13 and a half, with records she keeps in a spiral notebook that is beginning to look, in its careful handwriting and its attention to things most people don't measure, a little bit like the ones on the second shelf in the farm office. She still has all 4 of Raymond's ledgers. She has read them, by her own count, around 9 times. She told Walt Kepler at the Harlan County Fair in August of 2022 that she had started a fifth notebook. Walt said he figured she had. He said he didn't know what he expected when he saw her in that parking lot in 2019 with the legal pad under her arm. He wasn't sure she had expected anything particular either. She was just a girl who had read the notebooks, walked the fence line, pulled the cores, and written down what she found, and then had the specific kind of stubbornness that looks, from a distance, like patience. Raymond Moser never met his great-great-granddaughter. He died in a lawn chair in September of 1973, watching a storm come out of Kansas. He left behind 680 acres, a ledger full of observations, and a pencil sketch of a horse on the cover that nobody has ever been able to explain. He won that negotiation 46 years before it happened. The ground told the truth the whole time. She was just the only one who asked.